Let's begin with contrast. Because no number describes bankruptcy better than the gap between what was and what is. Caracas, Venezuela. This city was the richest place per capita in all of South America. Not Mexico. Not Argentina. Venezuela. Streets lined with European automobiles. Skyscrapers ascending faster than anywhere else on the continent. Hospitals with technologies that hadn't yet reached Madrid. A university that recruited the best minds from 3 continents. A 10-year-old boy born in Caracas in 1950 had a longer life expectancy than a 10-year-old born in Madrid. Not in a third world country. In Madrid, the capital of Spain. Food cheaper. Health better. Education more available. Everyone wanted to live in Venezuela. Then came 2026. Same city. Same country. Same bloodlines. Now the hospitals have no medicine. The universities have no electricity that stays on. People go to supermarkets not to buy but to wait for someone to die so they can take the food. Death by starvation is routine. 7 million people have left. Out of 30 million. That is the entire population of Switzerland. Gone. The question is simple. What changed? The land didn't vanish. The climate didn't shift. The people still have hands. Still have brains. Still have the same capacity for work. But the system they lived inside underwent a metamorphosis. From a mechanism that created wealth to a mechanism that created poverty. Like watching a remedy transform into poison. The system has a name. It is called the resource curse. Or more accurately, what happens when one valuable thing becomes the only thing? Welcome to Petrostate trap. To understand the Petrostate trap, you must understand one fundamental truth about economics. When a nation possesses one source of income that is exceptionally large, 2 things happen simultaneously. The first is visible. The second is not. Visible money enters. Enormous amounts of money. Venezuela at peak extracted 3.2 million barrels per day. At global average price of $80/100 per barrel, that is daily revenue of $256 to $320 million. Every day. Imagine it. Every single day. The government of Venezuela did not need to make difficult decisions about taxation. Did not need to construct efficient tax systems. Did not need to design sophisticated economic policy. Money simply flowed. Invisible, the structural evisceration of all other economic activity. What happened in Venezuela in the 1950s appeared to be construction. Infrastructure. Progress. It was not. It was what economists call Dutch disease. The name comes from the Netherlands. 1959, they discovered massive natural gas deposits in the north. Revenue from gas flooded into the economy like liquid introduced into a vascular system unprepared for volume. What happened? Dutch currency strengthened. Not because the Dutch became more productive. Simply because too much foreign money was flowing into their economy. When your currency strengthens, something insidious occurs. your manufactured goods become more expensive to sell abroad. Your manufacturing sector begins to atrophy. Factories close. Workers in factories find themselves unemployed. Manufacturing companies migrate elsewhere. Meanwhile, imports become cheaper. So why should your country manufacture automobiles, textiles, electronics? Why invest in industrial capacity when everything arrives from outside at lower cost? When petrodollars pay for it regardless? The trap tightens. Your nation, previously a diversified economic ecosystem, becomes a monoculture. Everything depends on one source, oil. Everyone in the economy knows this. Government knows. Entrepreneurs know. School children know. No one does anything. Why would they? Petroleum pays too well to change. The incentive structure collapses the moment oil revenue arrives. Why invest in innovation when petrodollars flow? Why develop expertise in manufacturing when you can import? Why become competitive in anything when everyone understands the real money comes from one place, a hole in the ground? The nation becomes simultaneously richer and more fragile. Richer in liquid capital. Fragile in structural diversity. You have transformed an economy with texture into a single layer. One point of failure. Now we enter the second stage of the trap. And this is where everything collapses. Because commodities have prices. And commodity prices are determined by global markets, not by the nations that extract them. Venezuela does not set the price of oil. The world market sets it. OPEC can attempt to manage price. But ultimately, if Saudi Arabia increases production, price falls. If global recession reduces demand, price falls. If new technology discovers alternatives, price falls. Venezuela controls none of these factors. But every economic system in Venezuela was designed with one assumption embedded in the foundation: oil price holds $1.80 100 per barrel. The tax system assumes this. The government budget assumes this. The social programs assume this. The salary structure assumes this. The entire infrastructure of the state was constructed on this single flaw. When the flaw shifts, the building collapses. Scenario 1: oil drops to $60 per barrel. Daily revenue from $320 million to $192 million. Government must choose. Cut spending? Reduce civil servant salaries? Eliminate subsidies on food, fuel? Or maintain spending? Hope prices recover. Venezuelan government chose to maintain spending. They borrowed. They printed currency. They waited. Prices did not recover. Prices continued falling. Scenario 2: oil drops to $40 per barrel. Daily revenue now $128 million. Insufficient for anything promised. Now the real choices begin. Who does not eat? The pensioner? The teacher? The nurse? The soldier? Venezuelan government chose to pay the soldier. Because soldiers have weapons. And when you do not pay men with weapons, they take money with weapons. So pensioners starved. Teachers went unpaid. Hospitals ran without medicine. But notice who still ate well. The men who ran the oil industry. The officials who managed the oil export. The generals who protected the oil installations. They had access to foreign currency because they controlled the export mechanism. They could buy imported goods when everyone else starved. The system begins to polarize. No middle class remains. Only those with access to oil money. Everyone else has nothing. Scenario 3, oil drops to $20 per barrel. Daily revenue now, $64 million. Insufficient to pay the military. At this stage, the system breaks entirely. Soldiers go unpaid. Police go unpaid. The network of social control, built on salaries, on bribes, on the assumption of payment, disintegrates. What follows is inevitable. People steal to survive. Soldiers operate smuggling networks. Police become protection rackets. The state no longer maintains monopoly on violence. Violence becomes distributed. Decentralized. Survival instinct replaces law. This is stage Venezuela occupies today. No normal government function remains. Only competition for access to what survives. Now, this appears to be a story about accident. Oil price fell. Nation collapsed. End of narrative. But this is actually a story about choice. Every stage of this trap is a decision made by leadership to not address the structural problems they knew would explode. In 1975, a panel of economic advisors presented findings to Venezuelan government: diversify the economy. Do not allow oil to become everything. They were ignored. Why? Because diversifying an economy is difficult. Requires long-term planning. Demands that people invest in sectors that do not return profit for 5 years. Easier to take the oil money. Easier to buy comfort today. Easier to ignore the collapse tomorrow. This pattern has repeated in every petrostate that ever existed. It is not an accident. It is a law of institutional behavior. Short-term incentives always override long-term survival when power is concentrated in human hands. The same trap has played itself out in different costumes across multiple nations. Let me show you 3 of them. Nigeria, the variant where corruption was the primary mechanism. Nigeria began with extraordinary potential. Population larger than any African nation. Fertile land. Earth rich with minerals. 1956, oil discovered. The nation believed this would be the accelerant for development. It was. Temporarily. But everything was built on this single foundation. Roads were constructed to access oil fields, not to connect cities. Schools were built where petroleum workers lived, not where population concentrated. Electrical infrastructure existed to serve extraction, not civilian life. When oil prices peaked in the 1970s and 1980s, Nigeria appeared suddenly prosperous. Skyscrapers. Luxury automobiles. Immigration from across West Africa. but the system was simultaneously building something else. Corruption. Because when one source of wealth is absolute, the only path to personal enrichment is control of that source. You do not become wealthy in Nigeria by building a factory. You become wealthy by accessing the oil apparatus, by befriending the general who manages it, by being positioned to extract rent from every transaction in the oil economy. Every dollar entering Nigeria from petroleum sales represents opportunity for theft. Every infrastructure project funded by oil money is an opportunity for officials to inflate costs and pocket the difference. Every construction contract is a mechanism for moving wealth into Swiss accounts. 1960 Nigerian GDP per capita was $750. After 50 years of massive petroleum extraction, 2010, Nigerian GDP per capita was $1,400. Doubled. But barely. Meanwhile, crude oil prices had increased 50-fold. The nation had extracted 100 billion barrels. Where did the money go? Into private accounts. Into military payroll to maintain order. Into imports of goods that could have been produced domestically but were cheaper to import because oil revenue paid. Into infrastructure projects designed poorly and executed incompletely, buildings standing empty, roads connecting nothing to nowhere, ghost cities. Today, Nigeria has a population of 223 million. Largest African nation. But 40% live below poverty line. Starvation is common. Preventable disease is leading cause of death. Meanwhile, Shell Oil, British Petroleum, Chevron continue extracting Nigerian crude with extraordinary profitability. They do not build hospitals. Do not build schools. Extract oil, pay minimum to Nigerian government, much loss to corruption, extract profit from nation. Saudi Arabia, the variant where authoritarianism temporarily worked. Saudi Arabia presents an interesting case because they, alone among petrostates, managed to partially escape the worst aspects of the trap. How? By possessing absolute monarchy capable of making decisions without answering to voters or parliament. When Saudi discovered oil in the 1930s, they made a different choice than most: do not spend everything immediately. Preserve capital. Invest in financial assets. Build sovereign wealth fund. This worked for decades. But notice, it worked only because absolute power could force discipline on a population that might otherwise have demanded the wealth be spent immediately on consumer goods. An authoritarian state can defer gratification in ways democracies cannot. However, and this is crucial, even authoritarian discipline eventually fails against the mathematics. Because oil is finite. Production rate declines. Extraction becomes more expensive as easy deposits are exhausted. Saudi Arabia faces an arithmetic problem it cannot solve: production is declining at approximately 10% annually. New oil discoveries are insufficient to replace extraction. Within perhaps 20 years, Saudi oil production will become non-viable as primary revenue source. The nation spent decades preparing for this transition through diversification, Vision 2030. But notice, they could only prepare because absolute authority allowed long-term planning without electoral pressure. Most democracies lack this capacity. But also notice, even Saudi Arabia's preparation is failing. Diversification into non-oil sectors has been slower than required. The wealth fund, though enormous, is insufficient to replace decades of oil revenue. The mathematical problem remains unsolvable. Russia, the variant where the system weaponized itself. Russia presents perhaps the most dangerous variant. Russia did not have the misfortune of possessing only oil. Russia is a diversified economy with manufacturing, agriculture, aerospace, weapons production. But over the past 2 decades, as oil prices rose, the state gradually collapsed these other sectors and reorganized the entire economy around petroleum and natural gas export. Why would a nation with existing industrial base do this? Because oil revenues were concentrated. Could be controlled by central authority. Manufacturing is distributed, requires multiple actors, harder to monopolize. A petrostate is fundamentally a system of centralized extraction and centralized control. It is ideal for authoritarian power consolidation. So Russia, which had begun as a diversified economy transitioning toward market mechanisms in the 1990s, reversed course. The state gradually seized control of the most profitable oil and gas companies. Used petroleum revenue to fund military expansion, intelligence operations, authoritarian consolidation. It appeared to work. For a while. But Russia faced the same mathematical problem as all petrostates. The system created was optimized for extracting wealth, not for creating it. When sanctions were imposed, 2014, then escalating, Russia discovered that it had allowed all its other industries to atrophy. Semiconductors could not be produced domestically. Manufacturing capacity had declined. Agricultural output was insufficient. The economy had been reorganized entirely around one commodity. Sanctions blocked access to that commodity in certain markets. The economy began contraction. Russia is currently in early-stage petrostate collapse, though the timeline is stretched by military capacity and nuclear weapons, which create options unavailable to Nigeria or Venezuela. But the underlying mathematics remain identical, the system organized around extraction of single resource, into which one person centralizes all decision-making, will eventually collapse when the commodity becomes unavailable or price falls. There is one more mechanism to understand. And this is the mechanism that makes the trap inescapable. Petrostates do not exist in isolation. They exist within a global economic system. And within that system, the price of oil is set not by the nation that produces it, but by traders, speculators, and market forces that the producing nation cannot control. Worse, because oil is priced in US dollars, and oil revenue flows into systems controlled primarily by Western banks, the petrostate is positioned as a supplier within a system designed by and for the benefit of the buyer. Here is how it operates mechanically. A petroleum exporting nation needs capital for development. They go to Western banks and say, "We will pledge future oil revenue as collateral. Lend us money now." Western banks agree. They loan capital at interest rates higher than Western governments pay. The petrostate uses this capital to build infrastructure, fund government operations, import goods. Now, the nation is indebted. They must generate oil revenue not just to fund government, but to pay back the loans. This creates a structural incentive. The government becomes less interested in governance and more interested in extraction. Because every liter of oil that is not extracted is money that cannot be used to service debt. So the petrostate begins to treat itself as merely an apparatus for extraction. Citizens become irrelevant except as labor. Infrastructure becomes infrastructure for petroleum transport, not for human use. Laws are written to maximize extraction, minimize costs. The state transforms from a government into a corporation. And corporations, when facing debt pressure, do what corporations do: cut costs ruthlessly. This means lower wages for workers, reduced healthcare, reduced education, increased exploitation. And when people resist exploitation, when they strike, when they protest, when they demand higher wages or better conditions, the state responds as a corporation responds, with security forces, with repression, with whatever violence is necessary to maintain extraction. This is how petrostates become authoritarian. Not because petroleum somehow causes authoritarianism, but because the structural incentives of debt-financed extraction require control, require the state to prioritize capital extraction over human welfare. The mathematics of this system are such that the petrostate must become harsher to survive. And the harsher it becomes, the more people flee. Capacity for labor declines. Extraction becomes less efficient. Debt servicing becomes more difficult. The final stage is collapse. But notice what happens at that final stage. The nation's petroleum remains. The oil is still there. The reserves are still in the ground. What has been destroyed is not the resource. What has been destroyed is the state capacity to extract it and the population that could have benefited. So what occurs next is something that appears to be salvation but is actually a different form of the same trap. A foreign corporation or a foreign state offers to extract the oil in partnership with what remains of the local government. They bring capital. They bring technology. They manage operations. In exchange, the local government receives a small percentage of revenue. The nation is no longer even a petrostate. It is a neo-colonial extraction operation, where foreigners own and operate the machinery and the local government receives subsistence payments. This is currently happening in Nigeria. This is currently happening in Venezuela. Chinese companies are taking control of remaining production capacity. This will eventually happen to Russia if sanctions continue. The trap does not end in national collapse. It ends in loss of sovereignty. The nation retains borders and a flag and a seat at the United Nations. But decision-making has migrated to external actors. The nation has become a resource, not a state. The obvious solution to the petrostate trap is diversification. Economists have said this for 50 years: diversify. Build other industries. Do not rely on one commodity. And technically, this is correct. But there is a reason why it almost never happens. When a petrostate is receiving enormous oil revenue, the incentive structure of the state, and of every actor within it, is arrayed against diversification. Why would you invest in building a manufacturing sector that requires 20 years of development, requires training of workers, requires accepting lower profit margins, when oil revenue arrives today and requires zero effort? Why would capital seek manufacturing when it can seek extraction? The only way diversification succeeds is if a state voluntarily constrains its own behavior, deliberately refuses to spend oil revenue, forces itself to invest in non-oil sectors despite immediate pressure to do otherwise. This requires a kind of discipline that human institutions almost never possess. Chile attempted this. Under Augusto Pinochet, though the policy continued after his fall, Chile used petroleum revenue to develop sovereign wealth fund, invested in education, diversified economic sectors. Today, Chile has the highest standard of living in South America. But Chile's success came at price: mass human rights violations under Pinochet. Thousands murdered. Thousands disappeared. The regime's brutality was precisely how it imposed the discipline necessary to resist the urge to spend oil revenue on immediate consumption and authoritarian consolidation. This is the dark truth: diversification may require authoritarianism to succeed. Democracies face electoral pressure. If a government refuses to spend oil wealth on immediate benefits, voters will vote them out. Someone else will take power and promise to distribute the wealth. The diversification strategy collapses. Authoritarian states can impose long-term planning without electoral consequence. But authoritarianism creates different problems: corruption, repression, human rights violations. So the Petrostate faces a dilemma with no good solution. Option A: remain democratic and spend the oil wealth in ways that feel good now but destroy the economy long term. Option B: become authoritarian to impose the discipline necessary for diversification, but risk the cruelty and abuse that comes with absolute power. Most petrostates choose option A. They collapse more slowly, but they collapse. Some petrostates choose option B. They survive longer economically, but at cost of human suffering that is difficult to justify. Very few petrostates navigate successfully between these options. Norway is perhaps the clearest exception. But notice, Norway was already a developed democracy with functioning institutions before oil arrived. It already had rule of law, transparency, democratic accountability. Oil was added to an existing system, not introduced as the foundational system. Most petrostates have no such luxury. They discover oil in the context of weak institutions, corruption, limited governance capacity. For them, the trap is not theoretical. It is mechanical. It is inevitable. Let's be clear about what we have observed. This is not a story about oil. This is not a story about the misfortune of possessing natural resources. This is a story about what happens when a system is organized around extraction rather than creation. When a nation's entire governmental, financial, and social apparatus is designed to remove something from the ground and sell it, rather than to build something that improves human life, the mathematics are inexorable. The system will optimize for extraction. Everything else becomes secondary. Education becomes secondary when oil revenue pays. Healthcare becomes secondary. Infrastructure for human use becomes secondary. The rule of law becomes secondary. What becomes primary is, how do we extract more? How do we control the extraction apparatus? How do we prevent others from accessing the extraction apparatus? This creates certain inevitable pathologies. Corruption, because the only valuable thing is access to extraction. Authoritarianism, because extraction requires control and control requires force. Wealth inequality, because only those with access to extraction apparatus accumulate wealth. Brain drain, because talented people flee to nations where skills are valued, not where you must be friends with the extraction apparatus. Military expansion, because the state uses extracted wealth to consolidate power through force. Eventually, collapse, because the system produces nothing. It only extracts and consumes. An extraction cannot be infinite. The timeline varies. Nigeria has been collapsing for 40 years. Venezuela collapsed in 15. Saudi Arabia has perhaps 20 years remaining at current trajectory. But the end state is always the same. A nation with extraordinary wealth in natural resources ends in poverty because the system built to extract that wealth is mathematically optimized to create poverty, not wealth. The irony is geometric. You possess treasure. The apparatus you create to extract the treasure consumes the nation that possesses it. It is not malice, not conspiracy, not mismanagement by evil people. It is the inevitable result of organizing a society around extraction of a commodity whose price you do not control, whose supply you cannot maintain indefinitely, and whose extraction requires nothing from you except permission to dig. Any nation that makes this choice faces a simple mathematical reality. You have mortgaged your future for cash today. And mortgages, by definition, must eventually come due. This is the Petrostate trap. And the trap is not something that happens to a nation. It is something a nation does to itself. The question is not, why do petrostates fail? The question is, knowing what we know about the mathematics, why would any nation build a system organized around extraction? And the answer to that question is perhaps darker than the collapse itself. Because it suggests that the choice to build extraction apparatus, to accept short-term wealth over long-term capacity, is something that most human institutions, when given the opportunity, will make. It is the default choice. It requires extraordinary discipline, or perhaps extraordinary trauma from past collapse, to choose differently. Which means the pattern will repeat. In new nations. With new resources. Using new mechanisms. But the mathematics remain identical. Extraction cannot be infinite. Systems optimized for extraction cannot be sustained. Collapse is not a possibility. It is scheduled.